Deep inside the ruins of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, tucked away in a sealed basement, there's this twisted rock like thing. It's called the elephant's foot. And for a long, long time, it's had a pretty terrifying title.
Yeah, that title, the most radioactive object on Earth. But it's not just some random piece of debris. It's become this legendary artifact from the '86 disaster. We're talking about a solid 2-ton mass that was just unimaginably lethal. But the real story? Oh, it's so much more complex, and honestly, way more fascinating than just its scary reputation. So, what in the world created this thing? To really get it, we have to go right back to the moment of the meltdown. Because what this object is actually made of, well, that's the key to the whole story. It's literally a real-life recipe for a nightmare. All right, let's get into this recipe for a meltdown. A lot of people think the elephant's foot is just, a big old chunk of melted nuclear fuel. But that's not even close to the whole picture. It's actually a totally unique man-made substance, and it has its own name, corium.
So, what is corium? The best way to think about it is like an artificial lava. It was literally born in the inferno of that reactor core failure. And it's just this incredible testament to the sheer power that was unleashed that day. A power that didn't just melt the fuel, it melted the building itself. So, how did this stuff even form? Well, first, the reactor core temperature just skyrocketed to an insane level. We're talking over 2,000 degrees Celsius. At that kind of heat, the nuclear fuel and everything around it just liquefied. This molten mess then literally ate its way through the reactor floor, mixing with concrete, sand, and steel as it went. And finally, this superheated sludge just flowed down into the basement, where it eventually cooled down and hardened into the shape we see today.
And this is where the story takes a really surprising turn. When you actually look at what it's made of, get this, up to 90% of it is silicate glass. That's basically just melted sand and concrete. The actual nuclear fuel, the uranium oxide, is only a tiny fraction, somewhere between 2 and 10%. The rest is just a jumble of other materials from the building. So it's less of a pure fuel blob and more like a radioactive ceramic. Kind of wild, right? So you might be wondering, just how tough is this stuff? Well, you're not going to believe this. Early on, when they were trying to study it, the robots couldn't get close enough or just weren't strong enough to break a piece off. So what do? They had to use an AK-47. They literally shot at it just to chip off a little sample for analysis. I mean, that's a pretty brilliant, if totally wild, solution to the problem, and it just shows you what they were up against.
Okay, so we know what it is. But that brings us to the really big question. Just how dangerous was it? I mean, when they first found it, the radiation levels were, well, they were just staggering. Not long after the disaster, teams measured the radiation coming off its surface at around 10,000 roentgens per hour. Now, to put that into perspective for you, a dose of about 500 roentgens is lethal for a person. So this thing was putting out 20 times a lethal dose every single hour. Just unbelievable. So what does that really mean for a person? Well, back in '86, if you stood next to the elephant's foot for just 300 seconds, that's only 5 minutes, you'd have a fatal dose of radiation. Just 30 seconds and you'd feel sick. 2 minutes and you'd start hemorrhaging. It was basically an invisible field of death. So what about today? Well, thanks to radioactive decay, that immediate, crazy high danger has gone down. The most intense, short-lived radioactive stuff has kind of burned itself out. Today, you'd need to be exposed for several hours to get a lethal dose, not just minutes. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still incredibly dangerous, but the threat level has definitely changed. And this is a really important point in the story. Nobody actually died from direct exposure to the elephant's foot. The very first teams who found it, they were carrying radiation detectors. And as soon as those things started screaming, going completely off the charts, they got out of there. They knew exactly what kind of invisible danger they were dealing with, and they made the right call.
So if the radiation has gone down, does that mean the danger's over? Oh, not even close. The threat has just changed. It's evolved. I love this analogy that scientists use for it. They say it's like the embers in a barbecue pit. The big roaring fire is out, sure, but those embers are still hot. They're still glowing, and they can absolutely start a new fire if you're not careful. The elephant's foot isn't dead, it's smoldering. So, today we're looking at three main risks. First up is something called recriticality. That basically means the fuel inside can still have these little localized fission reactions, causing spikes of radiation. Second, the surface is literally crumbling, creating this super radioactive dust, and that is a huge hazard if anyone were to breathe it in. And third, it's still giving off heat, which is just a constant reminder of the decay that's still happening deep inside.
Thankfully, though, this whole smoldering threat is now contained. There's something called the new safe confinement. It's this absolutely colossal steel arch that they slid over the old crumbling sarcophagus. It seals up the entire reactor building. It's just an incredible piece of engineering, designed to keep the whole site safe and sound for the next 100 years or so while they figure out a permanent solution. But, the story doesn't just end there, in that basement. The elephant's foot has grown beyond being a physical thing. It's really become a powerful cultural icon. I mean, you see it everywhere. It's in documentaries, famous photo essays, and it's inspired a bunch of video games set in the exclusion zone. What's kind of interesting, though, is that the amazing HBO series Chernobyl never actually shows it. But even so, that single image of it has become this universal symbol, a shorthand for the absolute most terrifying result of a nuclear meltdown. So, what's the big takeaway here? Is it just an artifact of the past, or is it a warning for the future? I think it's both. The elephant's foot is so much more than just a radioactive blob. It's a physical record of a total catastrophe, it's a scientific mystery, and it's become this haunting cultural icon. But maybe, most importantly, it's still down there. A silent, smoldering warning of what can happen when our most powerful creations go horribly wrong.